The night she staggered to his ranch gate, her dress torn and her babies clinging to her legs, she thought no man would ever take her in. But the widowed cowboy, who had buried his own family too soon, didn't know he wasn't just saving a life. He was inviting in a reckoning. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in angry shades of red and purple. Clara stood at the wooden gate, trembling, every muscle in her body screaming. She clutched an infant to her chest, while two little girls, no older than 5 and 7, clung to her torn skirt. Behind her was a life of ash and smoke, a life with a man named Martin, who called himself her husband, a man who saw daughters as curses, a man whose rage was a physical thing, a storm that broke over their small cabin night after night. Tonight the storm had threatened to swallow them whole. So she ran. She ran with nothing but the children and a desperate prayer. She ran until her bare feet were raw, until her lungs burned, until she saw the faint light of a ranch house, a single point of warmth in a cold, dying world. And then she saw him. Leaning against the gate was a cowboy, broad-shouldered and still as stone. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the weariness in his posture, the kind of weariness that comes from carrying too much grief for too long. This was Samuel's ranch. The town whispered about him. A widower, a man who worked the land alone, his silence as deep and heavy as the soil he tilled. Clara froze. She was a trespasser, a runaway with 3 children and the brand of another man on her life. She was about to turn, to melt back into the darkness, but his voice stopped her. It was steady, quiet, and cut right through the twilight. You look like you've been running from the devil himself. Tears she hadn't known were there sprang to her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice was a choked whisper. Please, don't send us away. The cowboy, Samuel, didn't move for a long moment. He just studied her. Then his gaze dropped to the 2 little girls, their faces streaked with dirt and fear, and to the infant in her arms, whimpering softly. Something shifted in the man's stillness. An old, familiar ache. He had held a baby once, too. He had dreamed of a house filled with the sound of small feet. But the sickness had come, taking his wife and his unborn son, leaving him with nothing but the punishing silence. He pushed himself off the gate and stepped closer. Clara flinched, pulling the girls tighter, but he only reached for the latch, his movement slow and deliberate. He swung the gate open. "You're safe here," he said. The words broke her. A ragged sob tore from her chest as she stumbled forward. He guided them toward the warm light of the cabin, a silent, looming presence at her side. Inside, he stoked the fire. He set bread and a jug of water on the table without a word. The girls ate like starved animals. Clara just sat, clutching her baby, watching the man in the shadows. This kindness felt like a trap, a dream she would wake from. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble. "I know men like the one you ran from, men who see daughters as burdens." He looked at the girls, now asleep by the hearth, their hands clasped. "A man who cannot see the worth of his daughters is no man at all." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "You've been beaten for giving life," he continued, his hand tightening on the arm of his chair. "I've been broken for losing it. Maybe God brought you here for a reason." His eyes met hers across the flickering firelight, and they were steady and unflinching. "If that man ever comes looking for you, he'll have to go through me." She wanted to believe him. For the first time in years, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. But she knew something he didn't. It wasn't just a man who was coming for her. It was a monster. And he wasn't just coming for her. He was coming for what she had stolen. The first few weeks were a fragile truce with the ghosts in the house. Samuel's silence was a heavy blanket, but Clara and her girls moved within it, quiet as mice. Clara learned the landscape of his grief without him ever speaking a word. The single tin plate, the neatly folded clothes of a woman long dead, tucked away in a chest he never opened, the way his hand would sometimes clench when one of the girls laughed too loud. He was a man entombed in his own home. Slowly, carefully, Clara began to let in the light. She baked bread, filling the cabin with a scent it hadn't known in years. She mended his worn shirts, her stitches small and neat. She taught the girls, Lily and Rose, to be quiet, to be respectful of the invisible wounds the house carried. Samuel watched it all from his corner, a silent, brooding giant. He thought he was just giving them shelter. He didn't realize they were saving him from the silence that was slowly eating him alive. One night, after the children were asleep, he finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. "What's his name?" "Martin," she whispered, her hands trembling around a cup of tea. "He drinks. He gambles. He says my girls are curses because they weren't sons." She looked at him, her eyes dark with a fear that went beyond bruises. "He swore he'd hunt us down. He said no one would ever take us in." A cold rage, an old and familiar enemy, stirred in Samuel's chest. He was wrong. From that night on, something shifted. He wasn't just their benefactor. He was their guardian. He started teaching Clara how to shoot the rifle he kept by the door. He showed the girls how to track rabbits, how to read the clouds for rain. He was arming them, not just with weapons, but with the knowledge of this land. His land. He was making them part of it. But Martin was coming. They both knew it. Every dust cloud on the horizon, every rider in the distance, sent a fresh wave of fear through the small cabin. It was a Tuesday afternoon when they finally came. 3 riders moving fast. Samuel saw them from the barn, and his blood ran cold. He ran to the house, his hand already on his revolver. "Clara, get the girls in the root cellar. Now!" She didn't hesitate. She herded her terrified children toward the trap door in the kitchen floor as Samuel barred the main door. Martin's voice, a drunken, furious roar, cut through the air. "Clara, I know you're in there. Bring me what you took, and I'll be merciful." Samuel looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. Took? But there was no time. The riders were at the gate. Martin was a big man, wild-eyed and mean, flanked by 2 men who looked like they'd been scraped from the bottom of a whiskey barrel. "I know you're in there, you thieving whore!" Martin screamed, kicking the gate open. "And you, rancher, you'll hang for harboring a thief!" Clara froze, her face ashen. "He knows!" she whispered in terror. Samuel's mind was racing. Thief? What had she stolen that was worth this kind of trouble? He looked at her, then at the 2 little girls peeking out from the cellar. He had given his word. He stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "You're on private property. Turn around and ride out." Martin laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "Not without my property. The woman, the girls, and the box." The box. Samuel glanced back at Clara. The look on her face was all the confirmation he needed. This wasn't just about a battered wife. This was about something else entirely. And he had just stepped right into the middle of it. Martin's eyes were fixed on the cabin, on Clara, with a greedy, possessive fire. "Give me the box, Clara, and I'll let your cowboy friend live." The box. The word echoed in the tense silence. Samuel had seen the small, locked wooden box Clara kept hidden under her bed. He'd assumed it held a few keepsakes, remnants of a life before Martin. He had been wrong. So very wrong. "There's no box," Samuel said, his voice a low growl. He was lying to protect her, but he needed to know what he was protecting. Martin sneered. "Don't play dumb with me, rancher. She took it. My inheritance. A land deed and a map. Worth more than this whole sorry ranch of yours." A deed. A map. Suddenly, this wasn't about a domestic dispute anymore. This was about a fortune. And Martin wasn't just an abusive drunk. He was a man who would kill for what he believed was his. "She's not yours to hurt anymore," Samuel said, his hand moving from the rifle to the revolver at his hip. The move was faster, more certain. Martin saw the shift. He saw the easy way Samuel handled the weapon. This wasn't just a farmer. This was something else. "You think you can take me?" Martin snarled, his hand inching toward his own gun. "I think you need to leave," Samuel said, his voice flat and cold. The world seemed to explode in a blur of motion. Martin went for his gun, but Samuel was faster. A shot cracked through the air. One of Martin's men cried out, clutching a shattered wrist. The other, seeing Samuel's deadly speed, wheeled his horse, and fled without a second thought. Martin, his face contorted with rage, fired wildly. The bullet splintered the porch post next to Samuel's head. Samuel dove for cover as Martin charged, the fight devolving into a brutal, desperate brawl in the dirt. They were a tangle of fists and fury. At one point, Martin got the upper hand, pinning Samuel to the ground, his thumbs pressing into Samuel's throat. The world started to go dark. Then, a small, sharp pain erupted in Martin's temple. He grunted, his grip loosening for just a second. It was enough. Samuel looked up to see little Lily, her face a mask of terror and defiance, a small, sharp rock clutched in her hand. She had thrown it. She had saved him. The sight of his own daughter siding with this stranger sent Martin into a new spiral of rage. He backhanded the girl, sending her sprawling into the dust. And that's when something broke in Samuel. The grief, the silence, the 10 years of iron control he had kept over his own rage. It all shattered. He moved with a speed and violence that was terrifying. He twisted, breaking Martin's hold, and slammed the man's head into the ground. Once, twice. He stood over him, his chest heaving, the revolver now steady in his hand, aimed directly between Martin's eyes. Martin spat blood. "Go on!" he choked out. "Kill me!" For a heart-stopping second, Clara was sure he would. She saw a decade of pain in his eyes. But then he holstered the weapon. "No," Samuel said, his voice a ragged whisper. "Men like you don't get an easy end." He looked at the bleeding, whimpering man on the ground. "You'll leave. You'll never come near them again. Or I will find you. And next time, I won't hesitate." Martin, defeated and broken, staggered to his horse and rode away. Clara ran to him, her daughters right behind her. She clutched his arm, her body shaking. "You saved us," she sobbed. He looked at her, then at the children. He saw the fierce loyalty in their eyes, the courage they had shown. He had offered them a roof. They had offered him a reason to fight again, a reason to live. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for us?" He looked at the setting sun, at the ranch that had been his prison for so long. "Maybe," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Maybe God knew my heart was empty and sent you to fill it." That night, after he had tended to Lily's bruised cheek, Clara finally showed him what was in the box. It wasn't just a deed. It was her father's last will and testament, leaving the entire prosperous family estate not to his son-in-law Martin, but to his daughter, Clara. And the map didn't lead to treasure. It led to a hidden safe deposit box in a bank in St. Louis. Martin hadn't just been abusive. He had been a thief, systematically stealing her inheritance, her future. He had married her for her money, and then tried to break her spirit so she would never have the strength to claim it. Samuel looked at the papers, then at her. He finally understood. She wasn't just a victim, she was an heiress. A woman of means and property, who had been living as a pauper. And now, her brutal, greedy husband knew exactly where she was. This fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The peace that followed Martin's retreat was a fragile thing, a held breath. Samuel knew the man would be back. Not with 2 hired thugs, but with something more. Something with the weight of the law behind it. "He'll go to the sheriff in Blackwater," Samuel said, his voice grim as he and Clara sat at the kitchen table, the damning papers spread between them. "He'll claim I kidnapped his wife and children. He'll paint you as an unstable woman who ran off with a stranger." "But it's a lie," Clara whispered. "The law in this county is a bought and paid for thing," Samuel said, his eyes dark. "And a man like Martin has deep pockets." The cabin, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. "We have to run," Clara said, her old fear returning. "No," Samuel said, his hand covering hers on the table. "Running is what he expects. Running is what you've been doing your whole life. This time we stand. We fight." But how? They were one man, one woman, and 3 small children against a man who could buy the law. The answer, Samuel knew, lay in the past, in the locked chest at the foot of his bed. That night, for the first time in 10 years, he opened it. The smell of lavender and memory washed over him. He took out his late wife's things, a faded dress, a book of poems, and underneath it all, a leather satchel. He opened it and laid the contents on the table. It wasn't jewelry or keepsakes. It was a stack of letters and a faded photograph. A photograph of two young men, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was a younger, happier Samuel. The other was Clara's father. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's my father. How? He was my best friend, Samuel said, his voice thick with a grief he had never shared. We served in the war together. We were going to be partners. He was going to move his family out here after the war. He picked up a letter. This was the last one he ever sent me. He told me he was worried about the man his daughter was marrying, a man named Martin. He said the man was a snake, only after the family's money. He asked me to look out for you if anything ever happened to him. Clara sank into a chair, the world spinning. My father. He knew. He knew, Samuel confirmed. And then he was dead. A sudden sickness, they said. I always suspected Martin had something to do with it, but I had no proof. And by then, I had lost my own family. I just shut down. He had failed his friend. He had let his own grief stop him from fulfilling his promise, until the day Clara and her children had shown up at his gate. It hadn't been an accident. It had been fate, finally calling in a decade-old debt. And now he had the proof. The will, the map, and his own testimony. But there was another secret in that chest, one that made Samuel's blood run cold. He pulled out another, smaller photograph. It was a picture of Martin, younger, standing with two other men. One of the men had a jagged scar running down his left cheek, a scar Samuel would recognize anywhere. Who is that? Clara asked. That, Samuel said, his voice barely a whisper, is the man who was driving the wagon the day my wife and son were killed. The story the town knew was a lie. It hadn't been a simple accident, a runaway horse. His wife, pregnant with their first child, had been on her way back from visiting her sister. A freight wagon, driven by a drunk, had run her off the road. The driver had vanished. No one ever found him. Until now. Martin wasn't just a thief and a bully. He was connected to the death of Samuel's family. The web was bigger, darker, more tangled than either of them could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about protecting Clara anymore. This was about vengeance. They had one chance. The circuit judge was coming to Blackwater in 3 days. He was a federal judge, a man who couldn't be bought by the likes of Martin. If they could get to him, if they could present their evidence, they could end this. But Martin knew that too. He would do everything in his power to stop them. The journey to Blackwater was a desperate race against time. They rode hard, Samuel with Lily in front of him, Clara with Rose and the baby. They knew Martin's men would be watching the main road, so they took the old mountain pass, a treacherous, little-used trail. They were halfway through the pass when the first shot rang out. An ambush. Martin and 4 of his men were perched on the ridge above them, pinning them down in a rocky gorge. "Give me the papers, Clara!" Martin's voice echoed down the canyon walls. "And I'll let the children live." "He's lying!" Samuel yelled, shoving her and the kids behind a cluster of boulders. "He can't let any of us walk away from this!" Gunfire erupted. Chips of rock exploded around them. They were trapped, outnumbered. But Samuel wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was the man he had been in the war, a soldier, a survivor. He handed Clara his revolver. "Keep them safe," he said. And then, before she could protest, he was gone, scrambling up the rock face like a mountain goat, using the terrain for cover. It was a suicide mission. 1 man against 5. Clara watched in terror, firing the revolver whenever one of Martin's men showed themselves, trying to give Samuel cover. The girls, brave beyond their years, reloaded the second pistol for her, their small hands working with a desperate focus. Then, a scream from above. One of Martin's men tumbled from the ridge, then another. Samuel was a ghost among the rocks, silent and deadly. He was taking them down, one by one. Finally, only Martin was left. The two men faced each other on the high ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky. And then, the final, terrible truth was revealed. "She was never supposed to die!" Martin screamed, his voice raw with a desperation that bordered on madness. "My father, your father-in-law, he wanted you out of the way. He paid us to scare your wife off, to make you sell the ranch cheap. It was an accident." The man with the scar. He hadn't just been a drunk driver. He had been a hired thug. And Clara's own father had ordered the attack that had killed Samuel's family. He had wanted the land, the water rights, everything. The two families weren't just connected by friendship and marriage. They were connected by a terrible, bloody secret. The revelation staggered Samuel. The man whose memory he had honored, the man who had been his brother in arms, had betrayed him in the most brutal way imaginable. In that moment of shock, Martin lunged. The two men fell, tumbling down the rocky slope, a desperate, final struggle. Clara could only watch in horror. When the dust settled, only one man stood up. Samuel, bruised, bleeding, but alive. He walked slowly back down to where she waited, the weight of a dozen tragedies on his shoulders. He didn't have to say a word. She saw it in his eyes. It was over. All of it. The trial was a formality. With the ledger, the will, and Samuel's testimony, the full scope of the conspiracy was laid bare. Clara's father's reputation was ruined, but his evil died with him. Martin and his men would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Clara claimed her inheritance. She was now one of the wealthiest women in the territory. But she didn't go back to St. Louis. She went back to the ranch, back to Samuel. Their grief was a vast shared country. They had both lost so much, been betrayed so deeply. But in the ruins of their old lives, they found the foundation for a new one. It wasn't a storybook romance. It was something quieter, deeper. A partnership forged in fire and sealed with a promise to protect the three little girls who were their future. They stood on the porch of the small cabin, watching the sun set, the sky once again painting the world in shades of red and gold. Not of blood this time, but of hope. "He would have loved them," Samuel said, his voice thick, watching the girls chase fireflies in the twilight. "He does," Clara whispered, taking his hand. "Your son and my father, the good men they were. They're watching, and they're proud." Sometimes, the deepest wounds are the ones that bind us together. And sometimes, the families we choose are the ones that truly save us. They had both been running from ghosts, but together, they had finally found a home. If this story of finding love and justice in the most unexpected of places touched your heart, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let us know in the comments, do you believe in second chances? Thanks for watching.